All right, hello everybody. Welcome to day one of online teaching. Here we go. We are starting chapter 31 today, and we're actually kind of doing a gap day. So if you look at your questions, which are supposed to be done, I would pull those out and have those next to you, and then either be taking notes on those, or if you decided to print out the PowerPoint or something like that, then you could take notes on that. I highly recommend that because we're gonna have a quiz here probably early next week on day like 4 of material, and so you can use those notes and your questions to help you on that. So anyways, date range for this chapter is 1929 to 1940. So it actually starts in the 1930s and goes through World War II. Today is kind of a gap day. Today is about, kind of what's going on between the end of World War I and the 1930s and the Depression leading up to World War II. So we're going to focus on the U.S. today and kind of where the U.S. was coming from versus all of Europe. And all of Europe is pretty easy to wrap up kind of how things were going for them. So let's get started, okay? So following World War I, countries were gun shy, so to speak, okay? They were absolutely devastated from the war. That idea of, before the war, they just couldn't fight enough, and now they want nothing to do with it. It's kind of like someone maybe who was a real guns enthusiast, and maybe they had a traumatic experience, and now they don't even, the sight of a gun would be really traumatic to them. And that's very much kind of how these countries felt. They were very militarized, and after the war, they just want nothing to do with it, and nothing seems worth it. Of course, some of that is a 4-year stalemate, economic devastation, 10 million people dying, and on top of that, right after the war, 1918, 1919, right, you have that worldwide flu epidemic, which killed over 30 million people. So makes our coronavirus that, we're dealing with right now look like, small change compared to what people literally about 100 years ago were going through. So the instead attitude was this idea of cooperation, okay, that we can work it out, that we can talk it out, that nothing is worth, going to the great lengths that we did before. So Europe's in recovery, and the U.S., just like the war, World War I, the U.S. really had an opportunity to make money off of that, okay? We, so to speak, became the European bank. They came to us for loans, recovery. We did send a lot of aid, but we gave a lot of loans, which the good thing about loans is interest, so we made money off of that. One example of that is Britain actually borrowed their reparation money from the Treaty of Versailles from us to pay back Britain and France. So the question might be, why would they borrow from us to pay back Britain and France, then just to have to pay us back? Well, if you think about it, Britain and France hated them. So the idea for them, we were, so to speak, a more friendly person to owe money to than the rest of Europe. The U.S. in the 1920s, we were booming. Like I said, we went in for the last 8 months of the war. We barely, were scathed from it, less than 2,000 injuries. Industry was growing. People were happy. We had come in over there, to save the day. And so for us, really, when we came back, we just kind of kept going and just shifted from producing warlike products to consumer products. So the 1920s in the U.S. Caused factories to expand, right? They changed what they were producing, and they really switched over to military weapons. So people were moving in, to the cities because there were really good manufacturing jobs. This is a time when African Americans were really able to leave again a lot of the rural areas and get their own independent paying jobs, which is really good. And after the war, we had to kind of make a shift. Factories had to retool. So to speak, they were producing maybe tanks, and now they go back to producing cars, Incomes are going to rise. Sale and manufacturing are going to rise because we're selling not only within the United States, but all around the world. And advertising is really going to take a new turn. If you look at the two pictures on this slide, you'll notice someone is incorporated into both of those pictures. Who do you notice that is incorporated into both of those pictures that in history we don't tend to acknowledge? I'll give you a second to think about it. That's right, it's women. All right, women are going to actually become the #1 consumers in the 1920s. And prior to the war, women were not the main consumers. Men, so to speak, they controlled the purse, so to speak, or the money in the household. And what's really interesting in the 1920s is women become more the target of advertising. So you see in this Coke, the pause that refreshes, she's busy in her day, or notice she's in an office, which again, prior to the war, she never would have been in an office, but this is where women were able to kind of break down that Victorian era curtain that we saw and really move over into a man's world, and so to speak, this idea of we're not going back, right? 1920 gaining the right to vote and really kind of pushing that. So like we talked about end of last chapter, middle class is going to rise, white collar jobs are going to rise, women's rights, and there's a real push or move away from the war to tolerance, and a great time for us. The automobile industry is probably one of the best examples of this, where you can see prior to the war the expense and after the war, okay, with the re-equipping of factories and the rise of middle class. So for example, the Model T prior to the war in 1908 was $850. Now that was more than most families were making in a year. After the war, that went to $290 in 1919. So I mean, a huge change at that time. Now, it's not that people could afford the whole $290. Two things happened. One, the middle class there was more of a market now. So you had more people. Before the war, it was only the rich. And after the war, now you have the rich and the middle class. So you have more people to purchase, which helps drive down the price. And you see the true adaptation of the assembly line interchangeable parts. So taking that skilled labor job and breaking it up into 20 jobs, which drives down the cost. And now you could be producing 20 cars at once instead of one. Now, with the more and more consumption of automobiles, people buying them, it created more and more jobs. So think about things that go along with that. You need better roads. Horse and carriage, you actually don't want concrete or pavement. It's bad on horses' hooves. For a tire on a car, gravel road's not great. You want a smooth paved road. So building of highways is going to be a really big thing. In fact, the highway between here and Barstow was built in the 1920s, and stuff. So it created a lot of jobs. Think about it. The service industry, to get gas, to repair the automobiles. So service stations, tire manufacturing, parts manufacturing, and car motels. If you think about what's the difference between a motel and a hotel, so motel with an M, hotel with an H, think about it for a second. If you've ever been to a hotel, you go in through the main doors, and the doors to your room are on the inside of the hotel. If you've ever been to a motel, like a Motel 8, Motel 6, something like that, the doors are on the outside of the building. Motel literally means motorist hotel. So these were kind of cheaper end hotels that were built between 2 points of location for people to quickly stay overnight. So the idea was that you could pull up your automobile, you could get out, go in really quick, sleep, get up the next day and go. And we still have motels, right? If you've ever been on a road trip or something like that, you might stay in a cheaper place versus if you're staying somewhere long term for vacation, maybe you would have a nicer place or something like that. So the automobile industry created so many jobs off of that. Now, most people couldn't afford the $290. I mean, that in some cases could be, half a year's salary. You're not going to just hand that over. So here's where the danger of the 1920s really starts. It's that buy now, pay later attitude. If you think about your family probably has some kind of debt. Guaranteed, maybe at least your house, right? You have a mortgage payment where you owe the bank, or a car loan, right? So this was not really the case prior to World War I. World War I, you didn't buy something unless you had the money. Okay, which meant you didn't buy a lot of things because you didn't have the money. After the war, there was this attitude of, well, put 10% down and then make monthly payments. This sounds familiar. Okay, and you can pay it off later. That's kind of the idea of I can have my cake and eat it too. I can have it now and I can pay a little bit each month, but by paying a little bit each month, I'm not broke because I bought it. But what that does is it does put you in debt. And so that's really the beginning of this movement of installment paying. Buy now, pay later. I can enjoy it now, make payments on it, and not be broke in the process. And that's going to be a very slippery slope. Okay, let's talk about society in the 1920s. So society in the 1920s is going to be really interesting. So while you have all this progress forwards, you have, women's right to vote, and you have new middle class jobs, and factories are changing and things like that, you also see a conservative movement trying to hold on to this change. And I would say it's a bit like what we see right now going on in our societies. You have things like the legalization of marijuana, you have changing perceptions of, let's say, like gay marriage and things like that in the last decade, okay? But you also have a lot of conservative movements who are maybe more traditional or trying to hold on to certain values. Prohibition was your traditional upper class Victorian era woman's movement, okay? And here's basically what they said. Alcohol is the root of all evil. Now, they're not completely wrong on some of that. Alcohol rarely leads to good things, especially in mass, or something like that. But their point was that in drinking alcohol, nothing ever good comes from it. The men are out of the homes, they're not doing what they're supposed to do, they're wasting money, and when they come home drunk, they could beat up on their wives and stuff like that. So if we just get rid of the alcohol, then the men won't be out, they won't be spending the money, and they're always going to be nice to their wives. Wouldn't that be nice? So prohibition, and here's the thing, it was really interesting because U.S. culture was, as we know, extremely dominantly Christian, okay? And whether you were actively practicing or not, it's not like today where it would be acceptable to say, oh, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. That would make you a social outcast back then. So even if you weren't super religious, you claimed it in public, you were in church every Sunday, or you were the talk of church every Sunday, if you know what I mean. So every respectable man, even in the back of his head, he's thinking, I don't want my alcohol taken away, okay? He also values his wife and his family and wants to save face in society. So men really went along with this, but it was very much kind of a women's movement. But what's really funny about it is that everyone behind closed doors, was doing it, so to speak, or everybody behind closed doors was drinking alcohol. They say the president had a secret stash. Everybody had a secret stash. And they say church attendance was pretty constant because when you took communion, you got a little sip of wine. There you go. Okay. Women's movement was pushing, like we said, the women's suffrage movement, the right to vote, the 19th Amendment happened in 1920. The workplaces are going to change because women moved into the workplace and stuff like that. Household appliances are really going to start to change. We're going to see a move in helping women better around the house. We're going to see vacuum cleaners. Ladies, oh my gosh, think about the last time you vacuumed, guys and girls, how easy that is. Why do you think we have carpet now? If you think about carpet is actually a permanent rug, so to speak, okay? Prior to the 1920s, you didn't have carpet. You had area rugs. So you had hardwood floors or hard surface floors, and you had an area rug. And if you wanted to clean that, you didn't vacuum it. You rolled it up, you took it outside, you put it over a rope or a wall or something like that, and then you got a big old thing that looked like a tennis racket, and then you beat on it, thrashed on it as hard as you could. Probably really good if you had anger problems or something like that, but a lot of hard work to get that thing clean. That's why you didn't have these permanent rugs. Now with vacuum cleaners, so to speak, okay, then you could have permanent rugs, which is what we call carpet now. So you think a lot of times like in your bedrooms or, more personal spaces, it's not uncommon to have carpets. Washing machines. I don't know about you. I hate doing laundry. I know I've shared stories in class that my husband, that's one of the big things he steps up and does because I hate it. Can you imagine having to scrub it, to hang it out to dry? Then when you hang it out to dry, it's all crispy. So then you have to iron every single piece of clothing so it's not crispy. And it's never ending. And I don't know about you, I complain about just having to put it from the washer to the dryer, let alone actually having to wash it by hand. So having a washer was such a big deal. A new washer was $85. And here's where that buy now, pay later started to happen. So think about it. The man comes home, the wife's been home all day, and this is where the door-to-door salesman really took off, okay? When the husband's away, they say the women will play. Well, here's where we mean by that in the 1920s. The husband's away, she's at home taking care of the kids, keeping the house, and someone knocks on the door, and she opens the door, and there's this nice young man, and he says, ma'am, am I here to make your life easier? And she's thinking, how in the world could you do that? And then he shows her a demonstration of, do you have any dirty laundry around? Well, what mom doesn't have dirty laundry sitting around? So he says, can I come in and do a demonstration? So he brings in his washing machine. He throws those dirty clothes that could have taken her an hour to wash. He puts them in there. The washing machine takes an hour, but in the meantime, she can do other things. Think about how excited she would be. She would be like, oh my goodness, I need one of these. Forget the diamond ring. I want a washing machine. So when her husband comes home, she's like, honey, will you want to make my day? Nah, buy me a washing machine. And you know the saying, happy wife, happy life. Well, this is the start of that. cars are going to make it people able to move outside of the cities. So this is where we have suburbia, okay, where people could actually commute into work. So we talked about before that people had to live in the cities, and that's why they built skyscrapers. You had to have a lot of people in a condensed area. Public transportation was not really efficient, and horse and carriage, nobody could afford that. So now having an automobile that, because you're on a buy now pay later, you can afford it and you can move outside the city, you could actually drive into work. But there were also hard things, like we talked about the Red Scare, the fear of communism. There was that horrible flu epidemic that killed 30 million people, and so we saw a lot of limited immigration, especially from Eastern Europe, because of the fear of communism during these times. And then we also see the formation of the mob. Last thing I'm going to touch on. So if you look in the top right-hand corner there, that very cute looking man there, all right, except that is the good old Al Capone, the OG of mobsters, okay? The mob got their start from prohibition, okay? They are groups of people looking to make money. Well, when you're not allowed to have alcohol, but everybody wants alcohol. Canada was not dry, meaning they had alcohol. And so Italian groups that were maybe undereducated, not having a lot of opportunities, saw an opportunity, aka let's start smuggling the booze over the border and selling them to all the people who said they didn't like alcohol, but behind closed doors loved it. AKA you have the birth of the mob, okay, and Al Capone being one of them. Here's a funny fact. They say he probably killed upward of over 100 people. I mean, he killed a lot of people or was involved in a lot of those things. But he, they could never tie him. You know, nobody would give him up. You know, they say nobody would, give in. They couldn't bribe anybody and stuff. So the way they got him, tax evasion. So doesn't sound very exciting and ooh, wow, got some big mobster, but it was bad enough that they added up that it got him a life sentence. So they sent him away on tax evasion, which sounds very boring, but I'm telling you, pay your taxes, because that time really adds up someday when you're 18. And he died in prison. Anybody know of what? I'll give you a hint. It's a brain-eating disease that came from the Americas. The only disease that came from the Americas. All of you were obsessed with on your last Columbian exchange essay. Remember that? I was like, why are you guys all so obsessed with this? Syphilis. He died of syphilis, which I feel is very fair given all the pain this man caused. Okay, here's a quick example of some of these household appliances and stuff that I was talking about. So there's that vacuum cleaner, which, ladies, that's going to change our lives at home. And of course now, plenty of men and women use this, but back in the, 100 years ago, this was definitely a lady's job. So, and see that, this is an actual ad, buy now, pay later, $2 down, $3 a month. Here's your, again, first example of a washing machine. That thing above it, those two little rings. So you would put the clothing through it so it would like wring out all the water so that they would dry faster and actually would dry softer as well. And the same idea. So this is the danger of the 1920s is it's that thing of I want it now, and you can't afford everything at once, and so you put a little bit down on your automobile, and you have a $30 payment on that, you have a $3 payment on your vacuum cleaner, you have a $5 payment on your dish, your washing machine, and all these different things. And by having little payments, you can afford all these different things that you never would have been able to afford before if you had to pay for it up front. And so this buy now, pay later attitude made the 20s roaring, so to speak. By roaring, they kind of see it as one big party where everybody's just kind of getting what they want, and life is great, and it just gets better and better and better. It's just buy, buy, buy. So the 1920s also are going to be really redefined by sports and the arts, okay? The radio is really going to change entertainment. So talking films was a big deal, or, silent films and then talking films, but radio really is huge. This is when sports really gets on the map, and I mentioned in class, people like Babe Ruth and stuff like that, people would gather around the radio and listen to the game, and this is where sports announcers really became a thing. You actually had your first talking movie toward the end of the 1920s. Jazz music becomes the really big thing, right? So it's that combination of African and European harmonies together, which the younger generations loved, but the older generations thought it was sinful to listen to. They called it Satan's music and how dare you, and stuff. This is when really cutting edge literature is coming along, like The Great Gatsby and stuff like that. Some of your flight records are being broken, you know. And then we got to talk about entertainment, okay? So think about today, like what you do on the weekends. I find it very interesting what I overhear you guys talking about in class sometimes, you know, and stuff like that. It's anything from sleeping to hanging out, eating, playing video games. I do hear the mention of the party every now and then the little hee afterwards. You know what I mean? But you get out and about, you have social media, you're doing this, you're doing that. Youth at this time, I mean, they didn't have smartphones, they didn't have TV, they didn't have social media, they didn't have these other things that they could do. So what did they do? Okay, well, here's a couple of examples, okay? We'll get to in a second. Young ladies. So a good young lady, okay, first of all, had long hair that she would pin up. This is considered a virtuous, appealing, Christian, virgin quality to have. Also, her dresses would be down to her, ankle or just above her ankle. She would not wear makeup. That was considered paint on her face, not acceptable. I would have been in trouble because I definitely wear my makeup every day. And so more and more girls were pushing to be rebellious, more cutting edge and be out there. So this is where we get the term the flapper, okay? So these young ladies were really cutting edge, okay? They would roll up their skirts and they would leave it just above the knee, like the top of the shin. That was like a really big deal. They would wear makeup, powder on their face, having very lighter color, kind of porcelain color skin was kind of the trend at the time, with a bright red lip. So bright red lip and really porcelain type skin, and chopping off their hair. They call it the bob, right? Okay, so just around the ears or just at the bottom of the neck. And this was what the rebellious girls would do. And the rebellious girls would smoke and they would drink and they would go out to what was called speakeasies, okay, which were the illegal bars where the bootleggers, that the mob would deliver alcohol. And they would go out with young men and they would listen to, horrible jazz music, which is wonderful actually, and they would dance. And so to kill the time on a Friday night, what did they do for entertainment? They would have dance-a-thons, which is literally they would dance and dance and dance and literally have a dance-a-thon, seeing who would be the last person doing this. Okay, now, how did young men impress young ladies at the time? All right, well, you'll notice the second to last slide, there's a couple of examples. Flagpole sitting. Yes, that was actually a thing. I'll talk about that here in a second. Goldfish swallowing. They would actually have competitions. Young men, your age, guys, 15, 16-year-olds, okay, the youngest and brightest of today, all right, and don't you dare come back from these 4 weeks telling me that you did this, because this is scary, okay, but they would get goldfish and they would basically dare each other who could swallow more goldfish. Yes. And ladies, you would sit by and watch this and be like, oh, wow, I want the one that, swallowed 5 goldfish. Ew, but that's what they did. Here's an example of the flagpole sitting. Can you believe this? So they would climb up on these poles. So sometimes it was they would do this like with telephone poles. This was a big deal. So they would see who could get the highest or who could get the most. So they would have your kind of, your gang of buddies and stuff like that. And you would see how many people you could get on there, or, compared to the other group of guys. And of course the ladies are like, oh, my guy's so cool. He went up 5 feet higher than your guy. And it was just, yeah, this is what they did to kill time until you fall and then time is done, right? That's not good. Okay, last slide. So all this is going on in the US, okay? Really it is. It's, so to speak, like one big party. It's a runaway train, and there's no thought of tomorrow, and it's buy now, pay later, and it's good times, and it's drinking, and it's flappers, and it's goldfish swallowing, and it's sports, and it's just boom, 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 and everything is great and stuff. But in Europe, that is not what's going on, okay? They are devastated from the war. They are in debt to the U.S. So on top of all this economic gain that we're having, we're also making killer money off of Europe and all their debts and the interest from that. Britain, France, and you could even put into this Germany, Russia, Italy. I mean, most of Europe is struggling from the war, okay? Britain has lost a lot of overseas trade due to their issues from the war. They're deeply in debt. The Irish are having a rebellion. They'd had their potato famine. They don't want to be a part of the UK anymore, so they have internal problems. They're losing colonies left and right, which we talked about that with Germany, how devastating it is. So that's going to really hurt Britain. So they're already in debt. They've lost money, and now they're losing their money makers. It's like if your job and then your income keeps getting cut. It's going to make it really hard to get ahead if you're already behind. So because this is when Canada breaks away, and Australia and New Zealand, South Africa. which they do peacefully because they weren't up to actually fighting to keep these colonies. So they're really sitting there and having a hard time. France recovered a little bit faster. They got a lot of the reparation money from Germany, which was borrowed from us because a good chunk of the war was fought there. They really pushed to decentralized industries, to really have things local, to have local businesses so people would buy and sell local, so they weren't as reliant on trade, which was helpful. But still, it was still a slow recovery. Germany is not recovering, and we're going to talk about that more tomorrow. Russia is now in the thick of communism. Italy is not recovering and super struggling like Germany, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. And this sets the stage for the Great Depression. And we're going to talk about how the party in the USA, as Miley Cyrus said, party in the USA is going to be over. Sorry for that. I know that that was a little bit, too far, but that's all right. You can handle it. So, so tomorrow what we'll talk about is we'll talk about the 1930s a little bit, probably 10, 15 minutes, and then you'll be starting your World War II or World Wars video for the second half of tomorrow, okay? Have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.